Now that the Supreme Court has ruled on Obamacare, what is the future of Obamacare? I'm Matt Staver, founder and chairman of Liberty Counsel. Joining me is Steve Cramption, the vice president of legal affairs for Liberty Counsel and general counsel. And we were very much involved and still are in the Obamacare case, filed the very first private suit on the very first day it was signed into law on March 23, 2010. Our case went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, was being held there pending this decision. And then the stunning decision by the Supreme Court that literally rewrites the statute and invents it, and then ultimately upholds it under the tax and spending clause is just astounding. I want to talk a little bit about the implications of that and then move into where do we go from here. But, one of the bizarre things about this is that we won the argument in this case that the Commerce Clause doesn't apply.
Which we thought was the whole game.
Which is, it was the whole game and that's what Congress said in the statute, that their authority was being based upon the Commerce Clause.
The lower courts understood it. Struck the act under that analysis.
And there's 19, 20 judges or so that ruled against this taxing and spending before it ever got to the Supreme Court.
That's right.
And then we got 5 justices that ultimately found that it was a tax and actually created it as a tax. The bizarre thing about that is that if Congress can't force you to act when you're not acting, force you to buy something when you don't want to buy it, they can say, well, you need to buy it, and if you don't buy it, I'm going to tax you if you don't.
Exactly, Matt.
So the end result's the same thing.
And what's really, I think, almost breathtaking here as well is the 4 liberal justices. We're talking Justice Ginsburg, Justice Sotomayor, Justice Kagan, and Justice Breyer. Had no problem whatsoever with that proposition. Congress, in effect, can do anything.
Congress, in their view, under the Taxing and Spending Clause or under the Commerce Clause, is all-powerful.
All-powerful.
Literally could force you to do anything.
If there's a problem that they perceive that needs to be addressed, and which is, of course, totally arbitrary.
Which is stunning.
Stunning.
That we have 4 justices like that.
So one more switch on the court, one justice that believes like they do. And this opinion is rewritten in the fashion that President Obama apparently intended in the first place.
Yeah, where the government just has this huge nanny state capability to force you to do anything. And literally force you to do anything. Force you to buy a Chevy Volt, force you to join a health club, or to eat vegetables because they're healthy.
That's right.
I mean, anything.
That's right.
And under this particular ruling, they can essentially do that by taxing you for not doing it. So they could say that you ought to eat vegetables because it's healthy, and if you don't, people who don't eat vegetables are going to have to pay a tax.
Right. Yeah. No limit.
No limit. It's unbelievable. Now, the couple of quick things, though. There was a 7-2 decision on the Medicaid, and essentially, under this Obamacare, there were 2 choices. States could either give up all of their Medicaid, which they never thought any state would do.
And that we're talking up to 10% of their budget, maybe even more. That's just an average. So you're talking a huge portion of the state's
And if they gave up their
operation.
Medicaid, then they'd have to do something to the people themselves.
Exactly right.
And so states are not going to do that. Or expand Medicaid. Those were the choices. And they never envisioned that there would be any other choice but to expand Medicaid. In other words, the states didn't have a choice. And then the Supreme Court came back and said, no, that's coercion, and we're going to essentially rewrite the statute.
Yes.
So the states can either remain status quo or expand their Medicaid program, but they don't have to. So it's voluntary.
You can't harm them. We're taxed under the now individual mandate/tax, but the states are not taxed in additional. They're not penalized.
Right. But what we will do, though, is say if Florida, because Florida is one of the states that says we're not going to expand our Medicaid program, if Florida doesn't expand it, Florida doesn't have to now under this ruling, which is contrary to the statute, because you either give it up or you expand it. There's nothing in between. The Supreme Court created an in-between. It's voluntary now. But if the people in Florida don't expand it, that's fine, but they still pay taxes. And so they'll be subsidizing New York.
Yes.
That's actually expanding its Medicaid.
Yes. So that's an excellent point. I think part of our difficulty here is we've already bought into the idea of socializing medicine. We have collectivized the payment process so that healthy folks, in many respects, we're already paying for the unhealthy ones. The insured are already covering, indirectly, the medical costs of the uninsured. This bill tried to force that into a formal kind of package here. And now you've got a broken system. The act that emerged, as you point out, is not the act that Congress voted into law. And many states, I think God bless them, are actually standing up and saying we're not going down that road, because in addition to the Medicaid expansion, they're also required then, if they want to go that way, to create the insurance exchanges. Which is, again, a bureaucratic mess, very costly for the state and everything else. And many of them are saying, we're not going to do it.
So there's two linchpins really to this Obamacare. There's the individual mandate, which is the funding mechanism. And if you strike that, the rest of the statute has to fall. But there's also the Medicaid expansion to expand coverage. And if now it's voluntary, what the court has done is they've rewritten the statute. And so if these states pull out, it's like you've pulled out the individual mandate.
Yes.
Because without the funding mechanism and the expansion, the mandate and the Medicaid expansion, Obamacare implodes.
It doesn't work.
So what will ultimately happen, I think, is in these states that say we're not going to expand Medicaid and we're not going to create these exchanges, what happens to Obamacare?
Right.
It implodes.
It really does.
So I think as we're moving forward, as bad as this court's decision is, and it's terrible, and we need to make sure that we don't forget that going forward, because elections do have consequences as to who's on that court. What we can do, I think, from a hopeful standpoint, and this is where Liberty Counsel and Liberty Counsel Action will be involved as well, is from a political standpoint, there's two things that will happen, I think, with Obamacare. One, I think people will go to the polls and they'll vote their values on Obamacare. Yes. And perhaps as 2008 gave us Obamacare, 2012 politically could take it away, defund it, or have enough people that want to repeal it. But even if that is not happening, or I think it will happen, but in addition to that, with these states, if they continue to ultimately work together like apparently they're doing, not expanding Medicaid, not doing the exchanges, Obamacare ultimately self-implodes as well.
And, there's that encouraging side to it, because, there is a sense in which the study of this act and its effects and our response to it is a study of America. And the federalism system that was established by the founders, whereby the federal government is sovereign in its sphere and the states are sovereign in theirs, is actually kind of accidentally working itself out here. States are actually standing up for the first time in a long time to the federal government and that heavy hand and the stick of, well, if you don't play ball, we're not going to fund you anymore. So there's an exciting side to it and an opportunity for us to get involved not only at the federal election level, but how about on the state level? Our folks ought to be contacting and watching very carefully their own executive departments and whether they're taking this stand. Are they really standing up?
Well, that brings up another issue too, in terms of, people are looking at the House and the Senate to defund and or repeal Obamacare. And, of course, there's enough votes in the House to repeal it.
Yes.
There's not enough votes right now in the Senate, and certainly President Obama would veto that. And so you'd have to have changes in those areas if you wanted to repeal it. But the other area people ought to look at is their states, their state governors.
Right.
Because the state governors and the legislative representatives there are just as important to torpedo Obamacare. Because if you can't defund it and or repeal it, you can ultimately kill it by having the states not participate.
Yeah, it's a fascinating dynamic, because I think the bill intended to rope the states in and force them to be the players that implement this act. But now the states don't have to go forward that way.
Well, it's a fascinating issue. And as you said, it's a fascinating look at America and how it's actually structured. So amidst all of the problems that we have, there may be some good that comes out of this, and I'm still optimistic that Obamacare will not ultimately go into effect in 2014. And God help us if we do, because it's a whole different world if it happens. It's the largest funding of abortion in history. It's the largest tax increase in history. It's the largest expansion of the federal government in modern times, and it will ultimately, I think, not only increase funding of abortion substantially, but decrease the quality of health care and ration health care as well. Go to Liberty Counsel's website at lc.org. Become part of the process to solve these issues. sign up for the Liberty Alert email and the Liberator newsletter. You can also sign up for the Grassroots Action email as well to keep involved regarding issues affecting your family, faith, and freedom. You can also ask for the Patriots Handbook on American Liberty. That's lc.org.